Good evening, everyone. My name is Alison Duxbury and I am the Interim Dean of Melbourne Law School, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. I want to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any Indigenous people who join us here this evening. This lecture honours the esteemed contribution to legal education, practice and to this law school of the late James Merralls, an alumnus of Melbourne Law School who graduated with a Bachelor of Laws honours in 1958. Mr Merralls was a resident tutor in law at Trinity College between 1958 and 1972 and was the Dean of the college in 1967 and 1968. He made an enormous contribution to the Australian legal profession over the course of his career. In addition to his illustrious practice at the Victorian Bar, Mr Merralls was the reporter of the Commonwealth Law Reports between 1960 and 1969, and from 1969 he was the editor of those reports. He has been publicly commended for his contribution to the Australian legal profession by many of our leading practitioners and judges, including successive Chief Justices of the High Court of Australia. In 1999, James Merralls was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in recognition of his service to the judiciary and to the legal profession as an editor of the Commonwealth Law Reports. On a less formal note, I draw from a eulogy by Mr Peter Willis and a speech delivered by the Honourable Michael McHugh, both published in the Victorian Bar News and also described in the Sydney Morning Herald. And I thank Peter Willis for alerting me to these yesterday. Those who knew James, Jim, described him as a Renaissance man, tutor, Queen's Counsel, horse breeder and owner, raconteur and husband and father. Added to this, he was a film critic and also wrote as a correspondent for the British Racehorse magazine. So certainly someone of enormous range of interests. This law school is also delighted to host the Merralls Scholarship, offered to a high-achieving Indigenous student across several years of their study. I'm grateful that this scholarship allows the law school to continually broaden access to legal education. Thank you very much to the members of the Merralls family who are here this evening for joining us. Before I introduce Professor Nick Barber, I also want to acknowledge our important partner in this fellowship and lecture, the Victorian Bar, and I want to thank the Bar President, Georgina Schoff, and I saw her this evening, who is here with us tonight. It is a pleasure to work with the Bar to honour our late mutual colleague, and a special welcome to members of the Victorian Bar who are joining us here tonight at the law school. So I now want to turn to our guest speaker, Professor Nick Barber. It is a pleasure to welcome Professor Barber to Melbourne Law School as the James Merralls Visiting Fellow for 2024. Professor Barber is a Professor of Constitutional Law and Legal Theory at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Trinity College. Nick joined Oxford in 1998 and has lectured extensively on constitutional law and theory. He published the latest of his 3 books, The United Kingdom Constitution, An Introduction, in 2021, and has published extensively across topics on constitutional law throughout his career. Nick was the founder and editor of the United Kingdom Constitutional Law blog and was the co-author of the blog post that sparked the Miller litigation, dealing with the relationship between treaty and domestic law regarding the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. And as someone whose area is international law, I actually remember reading that blog post at the time. Tonight, Nick will speak to the topic constitutional identity and the right to attachment. Nick asks the questions, what form should our relationship with the state take? Is the state like a team where membership is grounded in reasoned consent, or is it more like a family where membership is grounded in emotion and attachment? What's the difference between these two sentiments? and what could they mean for how we view our place in national society? Following Nick's presentation, my law school colleague, Professor Cheryl Saunders, will join Nick for a brief discussion on the presentation's core themes. Professor Saunders is a constitutional law expert, as I'm sure many of you know, and is the founding director of the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies. There will be a chance to ask Nick questions following this discussion, and so if you have a question at this point, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. After the Q&A, we will hand over to my colleague, Professor Farrah Ahmed, as the Associate Director of the Asian Law Centre, who will offer a vote of thanks. Finally, tonight's proceedings are being recorded and will be made available on the Law School's website in due course. So I will now hand over to Professor Nick Barber for the 2024 James Merralls Fellowship Lecture in Law. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. Thank you to Melbourne Law School for inviting me, and thank you to the Merralls family for supporting this. I came in today and I'm pleased to say that although it is being recorded, I was assured there is the capacity for editing. They saw me and this was the first thing that was said. But this is very good news. So if while I'm speaking you feel the need to applaud or gasp at my insights or laugh hilariously at my joke, don't worry, don't bother. You will do in the edit. Today I'm going to talk to you about one of the most important questions in constitutional scholarship, perhaps one of the most important questions in political life more generally. And that's this: what form should our membership of the state take? How should that relationship be constructed? And what constraints are there on the tools the state can use to fashion it? It's the starting point of a theory of citizenship. And at its heart, I'll be presenting you with a contrast between two types of membership, those grounded in volition and those grounded in attachment. On the one side, there are forms of membership that are products of reason and will. For a paradigm of this, think of a team, a group of people who've chosen to cooperate for a certain end, to build a house or a bridge, say. On the other side, there are those forms of membership that are grounded in emotional basis, those that we experience rather than choose. For a paradigm of this, think of the family, a group of people who experience bonds that tie them into the group, even if sometimes this is to their regret. So here's another way of presenting the core of this lecture. Should the state be more like a team, where membership is rational and choice-based, or should it be more like a family, where membership is experienced and emotional? So, an outline of the lecture. I'm going to start the lecture by discussing the nature of identity, what it is and why it's important to us, and the role of social groups in its construction. I will argue that our membership of social groups is key to the construction of identity and can be underpinned by two dispositions, which I've already mentioned, volition or attachment. Second, this discussion will be carried over to our discipline, constitutional scholarship. The state will be presented as a social group, one which directly forms part of our identity by creating roles and institutions that people can occupy, citizen, judge, legislator, and so on, but also indirectly through its regulation of civil society, structuring the way in which groups operate in the private sphere. Third, the lecture will ask whether our membership of the state should be underpinned by volition or attachment, and it will argue that whilst both of these dispositions can be present, it's attachment that should be the primary disposition underpinning membership. On the state side, this disposition is implied by its claims of sovereignty and needed to secure its stability. On the citizen side, this disposition is needed if we are to be the shared authors of the decisions of the state, decisions that are crucial to the fashioning of our identity, and if we are to exhibit the virtue of civility, the best type of relationship we can have with our fellow state members. The lecture will conclude, and there is a conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, that whilst we cannot be reasoned or argued into experiencing attachment, there are emotional strategies the state can deploy to foster and stimulate attachment. And whilst there are rational arguments for attachment, these rational arguments should be seen as establishing a set of constraints on how this disposition is established. So rationality, you can't be reasoned into experiencing attachment, but rationality may place constraints on the way in which the state deploys emotional strategies through which you experience attachment. And this ends with a payoff then, that we can talk intelligibly of a right to attachment, constraints on the way in which the state deploys emotional strategies in its construction of citizenship. One of the most insightful discussions of identity, I think, is found in the work of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, and my account follows his lead. Think of identity as a hinge. On the one side, there is the private self, how we understand who we are. In the middle, there is the expressed self, how we present ourselves in public. And on the final side of the hinge, there is our perceived self, how others around us understand us. These three elements are in constant interaction, dialogue, if you like, and it is through this interaction that our identity is found. Private self, expressed self, public self. On the public side, identity requires social recognition and a social context in which it can be realised. Society provides what Taylor calls a social imaginary, a collection of social roles we can occupy, values we can pursue, and institutions we can engage. So consider the husband, the lecturer, the trade union activist. All of these require social forms if they are to exist. So these may be crucial to your identity, but are meaningless outside of a social frame. The private self engages the public. We seek to craft our public identity. We act through and express ourselves in these roles. But it's not one directional, it goes in two directions. By engaging in the public realm, we show to ourselves who we are. We understand ourselves through these public activities. Our public self reflects back into the private. Those roles we occupy and how our actions within those roles are received by others shapes our sense of our private self. So there's a vulnerability here, a real vulnerability. How society sees us shapes at the deepest possible level how we understand who we are. As Taylor argues, we aspire to create continuity between the two sides, bringing the public and private into alignment, what Taylor calls authenticity. Identity provides a way of resolving a number of problems by acting as a hinge between the public and private. First, it allows us to occupy both the public and private realm, to be both individual creatures and social creatures. It bridges the two sides of our natures. Our identity serves to distinguish us from others, but it also provides us with the capacity to be part of social groups, to work alongside and to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Because we can remain distinct within the groups we occupy, because our identity distinguishes us, we have the capacity to exercise authorship over our lives. We can craft who we are, and by so doing, we can bring the public and private into alignment. So there is the possibility then of self-authorship alongside authenticity. Finally, identity provides an answer to the question of how we can persist across time, why we are the same person today that we were yesterday. Although identity is constantly changing and in a constant state of flux, the single identity that we have allows us to have a life story of our own, to say this is who we are, to say that we are proud of our past, we're hopeful about our future, maybe we're ashamed of what we have done. It gives us that sense of continuity. Taylor argues that society plays a crucial role in the formation of identity by providing a range of social forms that people can engage and worldviews within which they can operate. For our identity to be established, we need the recognition and indeed the assessment of others around us. Moreover, the recognition and assessment of other people must be meaningful to us, which means that they must share to some degree our worldview and our sense of value. Though Taylor does not put it in these terms, social groups are key to the creation of these conditions of identity. It is social groups that are needed to develop roles and value structures. It is within these groups that the rules develop that define these social entities that are absolutely key to our expression of ourselves and to our understanding of who we are. We don't necessarily have to be a member of a social group to engage with their roles and worldviews, but we will normally be members of those groups that are of most importance to our identity. This is because occupation of the most important social roles requires, ordinarily, that you be a member of the group that establishes their meaning. You cannot be a family member and be outside of the family. You cannot be a university lecturer and not be part of the university. So that's one reason why social groups are so important, and membership of those groups is important. The second reason membership of groups is important is because it enables you to play a part in the shaping of those groups and in the shaping of the roles that those groups establish. Being part of the group gives you some control over the contours of the roles contained in that group. You have some capacity to exercise authorship over them, and you do that in part by the way in which you receive other people's expression of their identity. A great many writers, Charles Taylor, Martin Lachlan, many others, talk of attachment as a type of basis for group membership. This may be just a matter of language, but I think it points us towards a particular type of disposition that can underpin group membership. And let me present you with two paradigms of dispositions that I think can underpin group membership. Volition, I think, is widely understood and commonly the basis of most constitutional scholarship and political theory. Attachment perhaps has slipped slightly from view. First, there is volition. When I was writing this talk, the paper on which this talk is based, I had in mind my first ever job. Let me take you on a trip down memory lane. As a dishwasher in a motorway service cafe. I chose to take on the job to earn money, you'll be unsurprised to hear. It was an act of will, of choice, to join this group, and the relationship was, let me stress, purely transactional. I had no emotional investment in Little Chef, for it was Little Chef, and the group was merely a means to my ends. Second, in contrast, there is attachment. The paradigm of this group is the family, a kinship group. This group is all about emotion. It would seem odd to say that my bond to my parents, my partner, or children was a matter of choice. To return to the idea of social imaginary, I think in terms of the rules that define or the structures that define what a family is, I would be failing in those rules if I thought of them, my family connections, purely in transactional terms. In my family, my fellow group members are ends in themselves, not merely means to my ends. Another contrast, chosen and experienced. Within a team, characterized by volition, we make a conscious choice to join the group. This choice is the product of rational consideration, options weighed, outcomes assessed. We decide our interests are better served inside the group than outside of it. But I should stress, when I use the word choice, this may be a radically unfair choice. This may be a constrained choice, this may be a choice that is a result of a position people shouldn't have been put in. But still, it's an act of volition to enter the group, even though our membership may be little short of a tragedy. In the family context, there are still elements of choice, but more often our family membership is experienced rather than chosen, something we recognise as something that exists rather than something we've elected to bring about. People are born into families or come together romantically. The idea of rational weighting of the connection seems in tension with this social group. Once again, attachment isn't necessarily a good thing. You can regret attachment, you can want to leave and find you can't. Your family may be a curse rather than a blessing, or certain members of it may be a curse rather than a blessing. Many writers talk of social groups potentially as extensions of the self, the extended self. Our understanding of our private self, who we are, extends into groups. But not all groups are like this. Teams, for example, work groups, are merely groups we engage or participate in. Our membership of the group shapes our identity for sure, but the group does not become part of who we are. I turned up to work at Little Chef, but I never thought of Little Chef as being part of my sense of self. Family, in contrast, when it is characterized by attachment, becomes an extension of the self. My private self extends into the group. The family, the group, becomes part of me, not something that I engage. This affects the way in which we understand the past and future of the group. Where our membership is entirely volitional, we have to deal with the past problems that the group raises, but we don't take on these problems as being things that we have done as parts of our identity. In contrast, where our membership of group is characterized by attachment, the group's past is our past and its future is our future. I care about what my family members did before I came along, and I care about what they will do once I have gone and deceased. I do not care, ladies and gentlemen, about Little Chef. in the same way or at all. This temporal difference carries over to the present, how we relate to the groups in the present. Work groups, teams rest on a continuing, ongoing act of consent. We're continually reassessing the merits of membership. I was always attentive, I'm sure you'll be unsurprised to hear, to the balance of interest that underpinned my decision to wash dishes in the cafe. If I'd found a better job paying elsewhere, I would have left at once. Our commitment to our family, in contrast, is not continually reassessed. There is no end date set for your membership of the family. There is no continued re-evaluation. Indeed, it would be odd if we sat down and conducted a cost-benefit analysis of our membership to our family. Are your children really worth the hassle? It's not a question you normally ask. All right, maybe some of you ask it, but in volitional groups, our membership implies a provisional acceptance of the decisions of the groups. We've chosen to be part of the group and, as such, have reason to accept the group's decisions. I followed the manager's instructions in Little Chef, but we have no reason to accept how the group sees the world, its ideology. We make use of the group's ideology, perhaps, but we don't embrace it. In attachment-based groups, in contrast, because the group is understood as an extension of ourselves, we are disposed to endorse its worldview. It's not just a matter of agreeing to go along with the outcomes reached by the group, we also use the group as a way of interpreting and understanding the world around us. As our sense of self extends into the group, its way of looking at the world becomes part of our way of looking at the world too. In volitional groups, where our membership of the group is volitional, where we are parts of a team, our relationship to others in the group is instrumental. We are members of the team because we think it's in our interests to be part of the team, but we're there because of what we think we're going to get out of it. So our membership, our relationship to others in that team is transactional. We're interested in what they can give to us. In the cafe, in Little Chef, my aim was to avoid work as far as possible whilst continuing to get paid. I saw my co-workers as tools, as pawns to this Machiavellian end. In contrast, where a relationship is grounded in attachment, the flourishing of others in the group can be an aim of that group. Their flourishing is part of the aim of the group. And as the group's aim is one of our aims, and as the group is an extension of us, the flourishing of others in the context of that group can then become an objective that is valuable in itself. Others can become ends in themselves, as far as we're concerned, within that group, and not just means. Finally, and most flakily, but I think importantly, when your sense of self extends into the group, you create the possibility of a form of life after death. Please don't all walk out. This isn't an attempt at conversion. But think about it. If your sense of self extends into the group, then your sense of who you are is encapsulated in an entity that exists separate from you, that can persist after your death. And I think this is actually really important and explains why we invest so much in those groups in which we experience attachment, because this is a way we can keep going even once we are gone. Finally, you cry, thank goodness, back to constitutional law and states, although I hope you're already beginning to see some of the implications that this discussion might have for states and citizenship and state membership. The state is one of the largest and most important social groups to which we belong. It shapes our identity in two ways. First, the state creates identity directly through the creation of constitutional offices, citizens, judges and monarchs. It sets the criteria for admission to these offices and the rules that determine success within these roles. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, the state creates identity indirectly through the shaping of the private realm, through civil society. The state creates the possibility of some social roles, establishing the possibility of partnerships, companies, landlords, tenants, employers and employees and so forth, but also shapes many other social roles that would exist separate from the state. So the state plays a huge role in shaping what it means to be a family member, the rules that define success in those offices too. So in terms of our identity, the state is amongst the most important social groups we engage. It shapes almost all the other social groups we encounter, and it is key then to our identity. We have a strong interest in being a member of the state in which we live so that we can participate in the decisions that shape the social context in which our identity is formed. Remember the ideas of authenticity and self-ownership earlier on? Being a member of the state, having some control over the way in which the state engages your identity, gives you a way of exercising self-ownership, gives you a possibility of establishing roles and forms that allow for the expression of authenticity. So which of our two forms of disposition should underpin our membership of the state? Volition or attachment? Should the state resemble a team or the family? First, the state's reasons for going with attachment. There are at least three arguments why the state should wish to ground its relationship with its people in attachment rather than simply in volition. First, the state's sovereignty claims, the type of authority claims it makes over its people, present that relationship as grounded in attachment rather than volition. Attachment is baked in to the sovereignty claims in terms both of their nature and the scope of the claims the state makes. In terms of nature, the state does not conceive of its authority over individuals as grounded in a decision by those individuals. So the state doesn't conceive of its authority as being grounded in consent. In part, this is because of how people come to become state members. Most of the time, the vast majority of state members have not chosen, in any meaningful sense at all, to become subject to the authority claim. Citizens are normally born, not made. Additionally, there is no ongoing consent here. The state does not accept that we can continually reassess our membership and exit whenever we want when we decide the balance of interests shifts. It can be very difficult to leave your membership of the state. I've argued elsewhere that there is a moral justification for the state's sovereignty claims, and if I'm right in that, there is also a moral justification of its claim that attachment should be part of the relationship with the state. In terms of scope, states manufacture worldviews. They do not simply expect people to do as they say, they present these commands as being justified, as resting on reasons that people should accept. So the state says to its people, not just, you must act in this way, but it is legitimate, it is right that you act in this way. And inherent in that is the state's claim that there are good reasons, good arguments as to why you should do what the state says. So the state is claiming that you should accept the worldview of the state, not just its decisions. Furthermore, these demands can require extreme sacrifices, such as death, that make no sense if state membership was grounded solely in volition. If Little Chef asked me to undertake the supreme sacrifice, I would have left at once. You wouldn't catch me eating the chicken early starter. It's only in groups characterised by attachment, where the self extends into the group, that level of sacrifice is intelligible. Because it's only in those type of groups that it makes sense to say the ongoing of the group is of more importance to you than the ongoing of your own life. Secondly, as I've argued elsewhere, states need to create citizenship to flourish, to be fully successful as states. But citizenship requires attachment. On the volitional model, there is a constant re-evaluation of membership. There is no recognition of the importance or value of others in the group as ends in themselves. Citizenship requires recognition between citizens who treat each other with civility, or, if Farrah prefers, fraternity. That is, with concern and attention, so it treats them as ends in themselves. And that requires attachment rather than volition. And finally, stability requires attachment. The state can't function successfully if there's a continuing, ongoing reassessment of the desirability of the attachment, of the connection with the state. This is one of the problems that authoritarian regimes encounter if they base their legitimacy entirely on the benefits that they give to their people. They do present themselves as being a purely volitional type of structure, and then there is the risk that as soon as the balance shifts, the state falls. What about individuals, on the other hand? Why should individuals want to experience attachment with the state? We can't carry over the arguments from the previous slide because those apply to the state as a whole rather than the individual. But similar sorts of arguments can be made for individuals. First, individuals should wish to experience attachment to the state because this provides a way in which they can exercise authorship, shared self-authorship over the decisions of the state. It's a long hope in constitutional scholarship that we could find a way of saying that the state's decisions are the decisions of its people, that there's some notion of popular sovereignty or ideal of democracy that means the product of the state is the product of the people in the state. But attachment explains how this is possible, whereas volition cannot. If there is an extension of the self into the group, into the state, the decisions of the state are our decisions, even if they're contrary to what we wanted, even if we had no knowledge of them. In just the same way, the actions of your family members are your actions because your sense of self extends into the family, and what the family does, you do. If your sense of self extends into the state, if you've got that expression of attachment with the state, then what the state does, you do. And then that allows us to say that there's a sense in which you are the author of the state's decisions, and the decisions made by the states are one that you have made. In contrast, for state members whose membership is grounded solely in volition, the decisions are made by an institution with which they merely engage, and they are the passive subjects of those decisions. So, given the importance of the state for the construction of identity, attachment is important in establishing self-ownership, of being the creators of ourselves. Secondly, attachment is important because it opens up to us the possibility to exhibit the virtue of civility. So citizenship is important because it's the best sort of relationship we can have with others in the public sphere. And it's only when we experience attachment that we can fully realise the virtue of civility, because it's only when we experience attachment that we will treat other citizens as being ends in themselves and not merely means to our ends. Finally, it's flaky, but I think it's important. Again, life after death. The state is one of the most important social groups we engage, and I think we value our connection with the state because the state can persist after we've gone, and our investment with the state then keeps paying off after we've left the stage. Now, the arguments so far have been ones of reason. Both the state and its people have reason to want to establish a relationship grounded in attachment rather than purely in volition. But there are problems with the arguments from reason. First, reason alone doesn't motivate. It's often assumed it does by political theorists, a sort of unspoken assumption at the start of their arguments. But we all know it doesn't, and we know that David Hume was right. It's emotions that motivate us, with reasons coming second. The social psychologist Jonathan Harent describes emotion as the elephant and reason as its rider, sort of pulling at the ears. There might be some degree in which reason can steer, but not much. Secondly, and even more problematically, attachment is an experienced emotional state, not one that can be accessed through simple choice. Think again of the family. You might be a member of the family. You might accept that you ought to experience attachment to your family members. You might wish to experience attachment to your family members, but you might just not have that emotional bond. It might just not be there. So you might listen and read the last couple of slides I presented to you. You might agree that the best form of state membership is one grounded in attachment. You might wish that your experience of state membership was grounded in attachment, but it just doesn't happen. You don't feel it. States know this full well, and states deploy emotional strategies rather than rational strategies to shore up people's experience of attachment, their members' experience of attachment. There are lots of strategies the states deploy, and I could talk for hours about it, but I think we can identify three very broad groups to put before you. First, there are the stories the state tells to make it attractive. I've rather pompously written on the slide the legitimating narrative of the state. But what I mean is the stories the state tells about its values, its missions, its history, its origin, its people, its leaders, that rich weave and tapestry of the state. This explains or provides an account of why the state thinks we should embrace it, the factors we share with it, the factors that make it attractive. And the state uses stories, symbols, and ceremonies to convey these to us. By the way, I think ceremonies are so important. One of the things I'm looking forward to in the book is thinking a bit about constitutional ritual and constitutional ceremony and why all states seem to make such use of this and what it is they're trying to achieve. Second and third, there are forms of piggybacking, where the state seeks to draw the attachment people experience with other groups onto itself. It can do this by co-option or by combination. By co-option, it draws other social groups into itself. So it makes those groups that were outside of the state parts of the state, as with incorporating a church into the state or nationalising a company or making a national group part of the state. It does this through combination when it presents the group as embedded in the state. In combination exists where the state presents itself to the community as providing the environment within which the group flourishes, the environment in terms of the infrastructure, the support, the mesh of rules that allows the group to operate and to succeed. But also by making the group a channel through which people can engage with the state. So this is a way of harnessing the sense of attachment that people have with that group. The state shows that group to be a mediating function, a bridge that people can cross to establish their connection with the state. I could say lots more about this, but what's crucial to take away is, and there are many versions of strategy, what's crucial to take away is these emotional strategies are devices to motivate people, not rational arguments that should make you want to buy into attachment. So we have attention. The rational basis for attachment is one set of arguments that we've discussed, but the emotional explanation of why people come to feel attachment is separate from that. So there's a contrast, perhaps a tension to be drawn between the emotional and the rational. And this takes me to the right to attachment. This is where it should get exciting for lawyers. So the right to attachment is a constraint on the types of emotional bases that can be used in establishing attachment, and a constraint on how those emotional bases are interpreted. So the state can put a gloss on these emotional bases. There are absolute things that the state shouldn't do that are always problematic for the construction of attachment. It can't exclude on the basis of an unalterable quality. So I'm afraid a very effective way of establishing attachment is with morally pernicious devices, such as racism. This is something that does seem to draw people together, but it shuts people out too. So the right to attachment speaks against the use of emotional strategies that take a group of people in the state and shut them away from the state, that deny them the capacity to experience attachment. The right to attachment requires that these emotional strategies not divide the citizenry, as with populists, not identify a group of true citizens and a group of second-rate, second-class citizens, because this undercuts the possibility of civility. It stops people recognising others as fellow citizens. The right to attachment speaks against the removal of choice in the public realm, all choice in the public realm. It speaks against the removal of all choice in the private realm. Because again, the reason why attachment was attractive was because it gives you an avenue through which you can exercise self-authorship over your identity through the state. And the removal of the choices then undercuts this. So the right to attachment provides a strong argument, I think, against certain types of state, populist, authoritarian, and totalitarian. It also reveals as problematic some forms of strategy. Combination, I think, is usually acceptable, depending on how it's done, but co-option is always problematic. Not necessarily something that's ruled out, but always problematic. If you make a church part of the state, like the Church of England becomes part of the United Kingdom's constitution, that always throws then into question the citizenship and the attachment of people who can't ally with that co-opted organisation. Secondly, there's a problem when the legitimating narrative of the state is rather than embroidered based on lies. So when there's a lie that people are expected to swallow in order to lead to their attachment with the state, you're building into the state at the very base a tension, a problem. There's the wonderful book by Kajiguru Ishiguro, the Buried Giant, and the way in which this terrible secret about the state is buried under the surface. And throughout the whole book, this mountain is something all the characters are trying to get over and get round and trying to explain, but failing to deal with. I'd love to talk about this more. In the British Constitution at the moment, in the United Kingdom, as I'm sure you know, we have problems about how we process the legacy of empire. And this is part of the historical narrative of the United Kingdom Constitution that's now being thrown into debate. Was empire a good thing or a bad thing? We're struggling to address that. And I think that if you read the work of Nigel Biggar, he's quite explicit about this, that he's presenting a positive vision of empire because it shores up people's present day connections with the British state. But it seems to me this is building in dangers and problems by asking people to buy into a version of history that isn't in accordance with the truth. Finally, another problem, radical change is also problematic. Think of attachment as being organic, something that grows slowly over time. If you wade in and cut the strands that lead to attachment and start afresh, it's a hard task to rebuild it. So when you read proposals for radical constitutional reform, one thing perhaps you ought to think about is, does this undercut the right to attachment? Does this mean people are going to then struggle to connect with this new constitutional order, even if the arguments for radical change are attractive? So in a recent paper, I've argued very cautiously, because I'm a Republican at heart, that in the United Kingdom, the monarchy is still an important part of what enables people to identify with the British state. Many people would identify the monarch as a symbol of the British state. And for that reason, I think in the United Kingdom, we should be very slow at present to get rid of the monarchy, because it's a strand that's grounding the identity that people have with the state. Doesn't apply to Australia, though, if you're feeling a bit frisky. Well, thank you very much. So, constitutional identity, attachment. The key idea I want to leave you with is that the state provides multiple stories and multiple pathways to attachment, and it needs to ensure that everybody has a viable path. This allows the flexibility of the sort. What matters is that there are multiple paths. There are paths you can adopt to attachment, not that everybody can use every path. So we should have a pragmatic approach to this. The upshot of this lecture is that the state should be more like a family than a motorway service cafe. But that apparently obvious conclusion has big implications for how we look on citizenship and how the state presents itself to its people. Citizenship should rest on attachment, not just on consent. It means that we as constitutional lawyers should be interested in and attentive to the emotional strategies deployed by the state to ground its relationship with the people. We should be interested in history. We should be interested in the stories the state tells. We should be interested in the ceremonies and the rituals and the fictions that exist around the state. These social structures are as important as, if not more important than, the legal structures that constitute state membership. When we study citizenship, when we study the laws that define that institution, the laws are important, but we need to put that institution into its broader social context. Formal legal quality in citizenship is necessary for, but not sufficient to, ground a flourishing form of that institution. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for a very splendid lecture, Professor Barber. So, just a few observations from me. And let me begin by saying how pleased I am to participate in this year's lecture to honour James Merralls. I knew Jim Merralls from the time I was a very young and green law student. He was unfailingly kind to me and generous with his time, and I worry now that I was not sufficiently appreciative. He was the person to whom I turned for advice when I decided to undertake a PhD, and the advice he gave, which I adopted, was not only useful but prescient. And it's very appropriate that his many contributions to Australian law and this law school are remembered in this way. It's also a great pleasure to be invited to comment on Nick Barber's presentation tonight. That very interesting lecture he's just delivered is part of a large body of important work on and around the concept of the state that he's undertaken over the last decade and more. And it's a privilege to have been given an early window into the ideas he's explored tonight about constitutional identity and the membership of the state. It's also great to have him here in Melbourne in person, and hopefully he'll be back. So I want to make three sets of short points, which inevitably won't do justice to what we've just heard, but just as a way of kickstarting what I hope will be a brief time for questions. I agree entirely with Nick's observations at the outset of the lecture that the relationship of people with the state is a key, maybe the key, question for constitutional scholars. It's always been important. Indeed, having a people is one of the defining characteristics of statehood. And this lecture makes a powerful case for the role of the state in forging people's identity. In addition, as matters presently stand, we rely on the state in myriad other ways, from support to daily life, to liberty, to effective international collaboration on critical global issues. However large and unwieldy or small and challenged, however artificial its borders, the entity of the state is now so firmly entrenched by the international state system that it's hard to conceive of any other way of organising the world. And yet the state, and hence the many opportunities that it offers its people, to which Nick has referred, is challenged from many quarters. The concept of the state is weak and unfamiliar in communities in parts of the world where other forms of membership have greater salience. The role of the state is undermined by economic and other manifestations of globalisation, including competition with increasingly powerful levels of government above the state. And the state in its relationship with its members also is vulnerable to erosion from the inside by forces variously described as democratic decay, state capture, populism, a zillion other terms. And part of Nick's enterprise here, as I understand it, is to try to grapple with that latter set of problems. So in my view, it's high time to recapture or maybe reforge the fundamentals of the relationship between the states and their people, on which so much depends. And so I was delighted to see Nick's work emerging. The second set of points I want to make revolve around one of the core arguments in the lecture about what underpins membership of the state, in the rich terms in which Nick describes it as involving both shared identity and self-authorship. As we just heard, two paradigms are developed, membership as volition or membership as attachment. Nick argues very strongly for the latter, and I agree with him, how could you not? And developed a whole range of very, I think, convincing and plausible arguments for it. Whether we want to always link it to the family is another question. There are families and families. But as between the two choices that we were offered, that seems the most plausible and the most constructive as a way of moving forward. His next step is to explore the basis of the attachment itself, developing, and for this purpose, the distinction between rational attachment and emotional attachment. And there I wasn't quite sure, Nick, where the balance actually lay. I mean, you pay a lot of attention to emotional attachment, but where reason actually comes in is something that we might discuss later. Now, I, of course, accept the significance of emotional attachment, and I think I'm as interested as Nick in the strategies employed by states to encourage it. Although I wonder whether those strategies should also specifically include the effective functioning of the state itself, without which attachment might be significantly less. And I also acknowledge the notorious gaps in the plausibility of theories based on reason or consent, which range from the difficulty of explaining the social organisation of the original people, if ever there was one, to the problems of ongoing authority for the decisions of the state. But I have a concern, maybe concern's a bit high, a query about this part of the argument, which may simply reflect the fact that I have spent too much time recently thinking about constitution making on a global scale. And the question is this. I wonder, Nick, whether your argument clearly enough distinguishes between the state as a continuing entity and its usually written constitution from time to time, which provides the framework of rules through which the decisions of the state are made. If we leave aside the theoretical problem of the original people, the almost invariable practice at present, and it's a development of past practice, is for constitutions to be made by a highly inclusive process which involves a wide range of people, practically as well as symbolically, distinguishing constitutions from ordinary law. Often this occurs in a context where the state is weak, so that whatever level of attachment that occurs is achieved through the constitution in process and substance, and the emotional attachment may be to the constitution itself rather than to the state. So what is going on here might be understood as a form of reasoned consent to a form of decision-making arguably resulting in self-ownership of the decisions, bolstered by processes to encourage emotional attachment, but maybe emotional attachment to the constitution rather than to the state. And the resulting constitution also may structure, limit the basic legitimating narrative and the pathways to attachment resulting from it, to which Nick attached so much importance, particularly in his closing remarks. Now, one answer to this concern may be simply to conflate the state and the constitution and to argue for constitution making as another strategy to induce attachment, and that may be right. Another answer, which in some circumstances at least would not be unreasonable, may be to attack the efficacy of inclusion other than as a symbol. But I just wonder whether the point needs a response so as to link an important perspective on the nature of membership of the state with some very familiar practical activities that take place on the ground. My third point relates to the right to attachment, which Nick developed towards the end of his lecture, but at least in the notes I saw, he mentioned as a payoff for lawyers at the start. And let me just say that no such payoff is necessary in my view. The entire lecture offers much to lawyers in its own right, and that probably means that I'm as keen on history and, and symbols and those sorts of things as you are. But I do think the discussion of the right to attachment with which Nick ended his lecture provides extremely valuable guidance on the roles that such a right may play and the way in which this, the attachment of people to the state might develop. I was particularly struck by the emphasis on the collective interests of the state and its members and by the baseline elements that Nick identified for the right. But there again, I also was struck by the challenges of the practical application of such a right in contemporary conditions. And there's a few of those, and I'm just going to list them and then I'm going to finish. But I look forward to discussing them with you at some stage, Nick. One contemporary condition, the extensive and increasing prevalence of multiple citizenship in most states. How do we manage that in the context of this discussion? Secondly, how would such a right to attachment apply to diaspora members of a state who may exceed the number of in-state citizens? Third, what is the impact of pluralism and or multi-level governance on the formulation of a right to attachment? And finally, the nature and scope of any right to attachment that involves continuing members of state communities who are not in fact citizens and therefore not full members in that sense. All of those realities, I'm sure, can be managed within the confines of this very rich and somewhat elastic set of ideas that Nick has put forward. But I think, again, they deserve attention as realities of the world in which we are living. So many thanks to Professor Nick Barber for such a thought-provoking lecture, and we look forward to seeing it all in print. Now, we have some time for questions. I've been asked to ask you to hold your questions until the microphone gets to you. And the reason for that, gentleman in the middle here, the reason for that is that all of this is being recorded and your question won't be recorded unless you speak into the mic, and therefore the answer will be meaningless. So please, go for it.
Thank you. Generally, the stronger the attachment to the family, that is, stronger the kinship, lower is the attachment to the state. And as Joe Hendrich in his book, Weirdest People, he points out, some institutions went to deliberate lengths to weaken the kinship so that the state benefits. For example, church took actions, series of actions 1,500 years ago with the deliberate intention of weakening the kinship so the church benefits. And some people argue that the governments in the last 100 years are taking several actions with the same intent of weakening the kinship so the institution or the government benefits. Would you like to comment on that, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Nick, do you want to answer, or will I get a few questions? Why don't you respond to the gentleman, and then we have another, while the mic comes down, we have another question in the front row here.
It's an extremely interesting question. A feature of totalitarian societies and totalitarian states is that they are greatly afraid of any sort of other connection people might have. So in totalitarian states, the state works towards getting rid of, trying to minimise the family, getting rid of churches, it worries about companies that don't structure into the state. I think this is a mistake and not inevitable. So I think totalitarian states end up weakening themselves by basing their legitimacy entirely on a relationship between the individual and the state directly, so that they have that direct connection with all of the state members. Because what it means is if there's a bad year or something goes wrong, those relationships snap like that. So that the totalitarian state is in a very fragile position. I mean, it goes back to something, Cheryl, you said earlier on. I agree that a successful state is well placed to build connections with its people. But a state that grounds its legitimacy entirely on its effectiveness is then putting itself into a very fragile position if it ceases to be effective.
Yeah, but it also does, as you said, require the state to be alive to the other forms of relationship within the state itself and to foster them and not squash them.
I think you're absolutely right.
And I think that gentleman also is right.
So the idea that a strong family is antithetical to a strong state, I think is wrong, providing that the state is able to show to the family that the family exists and flourishes within the structures that the state has produced. And the family can then provide a medium through which people engage with the state rather than something that stands in opposition to the state. Similarly, trade unions, companies, all these other institutions in the private sphere, the state can see them as threats and try to marginalise them and try to exclude them. That's what totalitarian states want. But that's a mistake. Far better to see them as allies in helping the state to foster the well-being of its people, to achieve its functioning, and to combine them into the state without losing the identity of these private entities.
Yeah. Adrian.
Thanks for that terrific lecture. So it surely must be, and I just wanted you to maybe say something more explicit about this, that we need both an element of rationality and an element of attachment in our attitude to the state. We need rationality in part so that we can criticise it when it might need criticism of a kind that we might be uncomfortable aiming at our family. So when a state has a deeply oppressive or genocidal past, we might need to be able to have the detachment from the state to call it out. So if that's right, I would be interested to know something more about how those two strands are combined. Secondly, I just wanted to offer an observation, which is my sense that in Australia you find quite a distinct form of distance from the state, and that is encapsulated in a certain kind of levity, irreverence and failure to take ourselves seriously, academia excluded, that I think offers, potentially quite an interesting model of what might be a healthy balance between attachment and distance, just for your consideration.
Well, thank you, Adrian. Really good point, very interesting. So the discussion of the rationality of attachment, in that section I was providing rational arguments as to why we should wish to experience attachment. And I think that's important because if there weren't any, then attachment would just be a mistake. It would be a social pathology. Sure, people feel attachment to these groups, but they're nuts. They shouldn't be doing that. So working out what the rational argument for attachment is shows that this is a morally valuable state we should wish to bring about. The problem is the rational arguments don't bring about the sense of attachment. So I can produce the most brilliant and most compelling set of rational arguments that anyone has ever produced, and yet a person may look at them, may agree with them, but just not feel any sense of attachment, because attachment is an emotional bond and you can't be reasoned into it. And while I was writing that, I was thinking of the tragedy of somebody in a family who wants to experience love to their fellow family members, who wants to experience attachment, but just is stubbornly failing to do so. They agree this would be a good thing, they want to do it, but it just isn't happening. So the rational arguments for attachment are important because they show that this is desirable. The emotional strategies, though, are the ones that do the hard work. It's the emotional strategies that draw people in to this sort of emotional connection and feeling this sense of attachment. But then the rational arguments come back again at the final stage because the emotional strategies mustn't then undercut the good rational arguments we have for wanting to establish attachment. So they provide a constraint, a side constraint then, on the emotional strategies that the state can use. So the emotional strategies are the engine and doing all the work, but the rational arguments are crucial because they justify the emotional strategies and place limits on the emotional strategies that can be deployed.
I think we only have time for one more question. Justice Hayne, Ken Hayne.
We've seen in recent years an increasing frequency of states withdrawing citizenship from citizens. The case of Shamima Begum in UK, several cases in Australia. And I wonder whether the case of compulsory withdrawal of citizenship is a case that reflects upon or informs, or vice versa, is informed by or should be reflected in the consequences of the analysis you have outlined for us. That is, your focus has been on formation of bonds with the state. Does withdrawal of the bond of the state speak at all to the framework you develop?
Absolutely. The Begum case is a very, I think a worrying, I would use the word worrying case. I was very disappointed with the way in which the British courts dealt with that. The idea that you can strip citizenship from someone, well, I think, without going into the law, I think that when somebody's recently acquired citizenship and they've made promises and assurances about how they will behave and then they don't, that's a situation, I think, in which you can say, well, you lied to us, yeah? You never really bought into citizenship. We take it away from you. But Begum's a really worrying case. This was a British person, born in Britain, born, I think, to British parents, who was then, let's be blunt about it, groomed and trafficked overseas to a terrorist organisation. Stripping that person of citizenship, I think, is deeply problematic and doesn't... The worst horror, of course, is for Begum, but it devalues citizenship more generally because it means that, first of all, it creates divisions in citizenship in the United Kingdom. So you couldn't strip me of my citizenship, however much you want to, yeah, because my family are British as far back as we go. You could strip Begum's citizenship away because her family came from, I think, Bangladesh. So there's a nasty sort of racist undertone to this. Some people who are supposedly 100% British citizens actually can have their citizenship taken away from them, whereas others can't. So that speaks to the point I made earlier on about the right to attachment speaking against the divisions of citizens. Secondly, it's worrying because it says to people who've got ancestry outside of the United Kingdom, you extend your sense of self into the state, fully embracing the United Kingdom. That might well be a mistake. Not just because you're a second-class citizen, but because it could be taken away from you at any time. It's an administrative whim. So I think the Begum case is extremely... And I should just say, she was 15 when she was trafficked. Yes, it's a very worrying case. And then she had three children in a refugee camp, all of whom died, all of whom probably were British citizens too, if her citizenship hadn't been stripped from her. So, yeah, the Begum case really does go directly to the topic of this talk, I think.
Nick, can I just ask, in the case of Begum and the people born outside the UK, as you were saying, is the real problem that they have an alternative citizenship?
That was the argument given, but to be clear...
But anyway, they would have stripped it, even if British citizenship was the only citizenship she had?
So Begum only had British citizenship.
She wasn't a Jew.
She was born in Britain, she grew up in Britain. Her parents, I believe, had British citizenship too, but her grandparents were Bangladeshi. And my understanding is, I'm sorry, I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I hope I've got it right, but the Bangladeshi system would allow her then to apply for citizenship of Bangladesh and reclaim it. So the British state said, well, you're all right, you can go back to Bangladesh.
Great.
So this girl, this 15-year-old girl who was told that she should leave the UK and
I know.
Yeah.
Terrible.
So.
Okay, Farrah. Gosh, that's terrible.
Terrible case.
My name is Farrah Ahmed. I'm a professor at Melbourne Law School, and I have the honor of bringing this event to a close. Tonight's discussion featured the themes of constitutional identity and attachment and community. So it's really fitting, I think, to note that the evening's event itself was the product of really thoughtful, collegial collaboration between a range of institutions and a range of individuals. So let me begin by thanking Professor Nick Barber for such a thoughtful and engaging lecture on this question of constitutional identity. We're particularly grateful, as Professor Barber has weathered long flights, jet lag, storms, howling winds, hail of Melbourne weather to be with us today. And in return for all of that, we have this small gift.
Thank you. It's very kind.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Nick. I want to thank my colleague, Professor Cheryl Saunders, for her characteristically incisive and enlightening comments. I think they really enriched the discussion. I would particularly like to express my gratitude to the Merralls family and the Victorian Bar, and I know there are representatives here today, for collaborating with Melbourne Law School to enable Professor Barber's visit. Apart from this event, this collaboration gives scholars, students, practitioners in Melbourne as well as Sydney the opportunity to discuss pressing questions in constitutional law and legal theory with Professor Barber over 2 weeks. I also want to recognize the leadership of Melbourne Law School, Professor and our Dean, Alison Duxbury, our previous Dean, Matthew Harding, Associate Dean Heather Douglas, as well as our events team, particularly Karina Selim, for their role in designing, planning, and executing this event. And finally, I would like to close as we opened with the acknowledgement that this event took place on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to acknowledge that these ongoing conversations that we're having about constitutional law and identity take place against a context of ongoing struggles for Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, voice, and truth-telling. So thank you all for joining us in this conversation.